The Maine Bird Atlas, for those of you not familiar, was basically the most comprehensive assessment of Maine's avifauna ever completed, of Maine's breeding and wintering birds, the scale of which is unprecedented. It was largely a citizen science project, and it engaged over 6,500 observers contributed to this project, collecting nearly 2 million bird records of 332 species around the state. And we divided this entire project into two components, a breeding component and a wintering component. And the breeding component, we achieved 100% coverage of our goals for statewide sampling. And for the winter season, we achieved 83% coverage of the state, which was even more than we expected going into it, because there are their own challenges of access and availability in the winter. So, huge scale of the project, and this is the first we've been quiet for a couple years now, and this is the first real outreach presentation now that we've synthesized all the data, so I'm really excited to share it with you. But I do need to acknowledge everything that you're about to see tonight has been a huge collective effort, certainly of 6,500 volunteers, but I have been joined by a staff of 5 other individuals from the outset of this project, and we worked together throughout. So as mentioned, I served as the project director, but I really need to also highlight Glenn Mittelhauser serving as the project coordinator. He definitely carried the heaviest load of all of the staff throughout this entire project. He runs the Maine Natural History Observatory, and we were also part of the core staff team was Evan Adams from Biodiversity Research Institute, Doug Hitchcox of Maine Audubon, Amy McLaughlin, and Logan Parker. And we were joined, sustained and supported throughout by a steering committee and also a whole army of amazing field technicians that totaled 28 over the years of the project. While that sounds like a big number, we had about 10 of these individuals, 10 to 12 every year working for us. So over 5 years to really only reach 28 means we had a lot of continuity in the data collection of some of our specific sampling surveys that we did. And so that really helped ensure and uplift the quality of the data that went into this project. And then, of course, the backbone were all of our volunteers, from an army of regional coordinators that supported this to all of you that raised your hands, that you participated and contributed to this project. So we'll take a step back and just zoom out a little bit, broad scale. The goal of the Maine Bird Atlas was to document the distribution and relative abundance of all of Maine's breeding and wintering birds across the entire state. So I'm going to go through this will be the most text-dense slide of the night, I think. Just overview of the objectives. The first one was to replicate a first breeding bird atlas that was actually completed in Maine back in the late 70s to early 80s, and to define changes in species range limits and distribution of diversity. The second overarching objective was to produce a good comprehensive set of abundance data. In a lot of respects, this project gave us a lot of baseline density information that wasn't already existing for many of our birds. We also aimed to complete the first ever winter atlas, a comprehensive assessment of Maine's winter bird populations and distributions had never been assessed. And largely, we also really wanted to emphasize the community engagement. We wanted to reach out to make this a citizen science project. And I know there's a lot around the term citizen science these days, but we think of this as global citizenship that transcends any political or geographic boundaries. So that is the spirit in which I use this term moving forward. And wanted to use the Atlas as a platform to get this engagement and really connect people with nature. And then the overarching theme was also that all of these objectives were guided by the need to identify priority bird habitats and regions so that we could help inform conservation and management practices moving forward. So I'm just going to break each of these objectives down individually in the next series of slides. We'll go through each one at a time and kind of methods and present some results from this. So the first objective, again, was just to replicate this first effort that was completed between 78 and 83. And all you're seeing here on the, right-hand side of the screen is the grid of the state that was used to complete that first atlas. So looking at a change in and replicating this project and looking at a change in bird distribution and diversity over time really helps give us a window into ecological processes that could be taking place. So how did we accomplish this? Just like the map on the previous slide where the state was gridded out, we had the same kind of layout where we gridded the state. And what you're seeing is a map of what we call blocks. Our survey unit for the state was basically a sixth of a topo quad. So this grid shows topo quads, and we broke it down into sixths of topo quad, which is about 9 square mile area. And that was at the block level was how we collected the data. And we set a minimum goal of completing 1 block in every topo quad. And in order to achieve that, we chose specific areas, as you can see by the colors on the map. But the green and the pink just show what we designated as priority sampling blocks. This gave us kind of a general randomized design around the state, but it also helped us force some of you into places you might not normally have gone, because we didn't want people just going where they knew birds were. It's important for us to also know where birds aren't. So this gave us the sampling framework, and then the goal was to send individuals out in the field to collect the data over this 5-year period. So data collection for the Maine Bird Atlas happened between 2018 and 2022. And now on to the fun part. So what did we send our volunteers out? What did we ask of them once they went out into the field? So we basically, in addition to just documenting what birds you were seeing, we asked of everyone to report what the birds were doing and assign it basically a breeding category. So depending on what your observation may have been, you go out afield and you see a song sparrow at the top singing. That behavior, the bird singing, would be indicative of a bird possibly breeding in the area. If you see a turkey doing a courtship display, that would be indicative of a bird probably breeding in the area. And then if you take it up the next level, you find an occupied nest box, you actually see young, or you find birds carrying food like these warblers on the right-hand side of the screen. That confirms breeding in the area. And so those were all the pieces of information in the field that we were asking of volunteers to contribute. So I'm just gonna make a little aside to go through some of the challenges that we faced. Again, just give you an idea of the scope and the scale of this project. More than 94% of Maine is privately owned. So just accessing all of those blocks spread out all over the state was a challenge in and of itself. But then also getting people to go into remote areas of the state and going out of places that were familiar to them. And then once you're in those remote places, there's a whole new suite of challenges that everybody faced. And so I highlight this because we're very grateful to the efforts that you are about to see in the summary. And then just organizing and recruiting all of our volunteers and coordinating their efforts and training them on the same protocols. And then year 3 of the project, throw in a global pandemic that shuts the world down and forbids group birding efforts, but we stayed on. The Maine Bird Atlas continued on. And then we add in everything that I just talked about becomes tenfold when we consider winter season, just because of access and difficulty and safety concerns. And much of the state is really not even accessible in the winter off of a snowmobile, which we learned the basic birding demographic doesn't really overlap with the snowmobiling demographic. So that's a good lesson for Atlas 3. So I will say this is the most I'm going to go into mention winter for now. The rest of Objective 1 and 2 are focused on the breeding season. We'll get into winter later. But so despite all of these challenges, our volunteers, you all in this room that contributed to this project, exceeded our expectations. So of all of those priority blocks that I mentioned, those green, this is the same map, just colored differently. Those green and pink blocks on that map totaled 906 of a total over 4,000 in the state. But as you can see from this graph, we far exceeded completion requirements, our minimum of that 906 by completing over 1,300, and almost all of our 4,080 blocks, the orange bar on the graph shows blocks with some data. They may not have met the minimum requirements. And then this is just another fun sort of way to view the effort results. The first 3 years in comparison to the 4th and the 5th final year of the project, and how all of that effort came together to really meet our goals for sampling birds around the state. And so what you're going to see next are some individual species results slides that translate these thousands and thousands of hours of effort into usable data. But it's not just going to be dots and images on a map. What the results show us, and that I'm excited to share tonight, are insights into Maine's birds, and also insights into that change over time from the first atlas. And that's, again, where we can really look at using that as a tool for ecology and conservation efforts moving forward. So I will just use this first one to orient you to what you're looking at, and then all the other maps that we go into are going to be the same. So what you see here on the left side of the screen are basically, again, everything's gridded out by that block level. And what you are seeing is the highest evidence of breeding recorded for bald eagles in this example in the state. So the yellow is possibly breeding, the lime green is probable, and the darkest green identifies confirmed. And then the map on the right shows the change since the first atlas. So where you see up arrows, that was a species that was not present in the area in the first atlas. If it's a down arrow, pretty self-explanatory. They were there in the first atlas and were not in the second. And the gray dots show no change. I will point out that there are two different colored up triangles. The first atlas, while amazing for its time, in the late 70s faced a lot of limitations in capacity. So especially for some of the more remote areas in the state, they just weren't able to sample. So where we identified change, the gray arrows denote where there wasn't actually adequate effort in the first atlas. So that change may not be a reflection of the birds themselves, but just a difference in the amount of effort. And so I put bald eagle in here. It's very familiar, but it also may be one of Maine's biggest success stories, rivaled only by the reintroduction and stabilization of wild turkey in the state. Both together were species that turkeys have been completely extirpated, and bald eagle is the only one that has been actually removed from the Maine endangered species list and identified as recovered, the two. And so you can see the change over time is especially interesting, where it's largely an increase for bald eagles since the late 70s into the early 80s. The only spot really is this down east region where there are some gray dots, and that sort of shows at the close of the first atlas, there were 74 or 75 pairs of eagles in the state, primarily in that region, and their recovery kind of radiated north and west from there. Kestrels is an interesting example that highlights, we see a kind of a distribution of increases and decreases over the state. Definitely a loss in that down east region where the bald eagles had radiated from, unrelated, not necessarily related. But we also see an increase in the northern part of the state for kestrels. Some of this, again, may be a product of effort, but a lot of this could also be a reflection of changing timber practices. And as clear cutting up there has shifted to shelter wood cuts that leave a lot more standing dead trees, this may actually be creating habitat for kestrels, which are cavity nesting birds, and they kind of like some of the open spaces to hunt in. Buntings was probably one of the biggest surprises, like as a biologist or and conservationist. Research perspective, this is not a species we really had our eye on, but they really, with respect to expansion and increases in the state, were a surprise. It's a common bird of those shrubby edges and power lines, but especially in the North Maine woods, that northern northwest portion of the state. For a species with that habitat association, we were not expecting to see such expansion in the North Maine woods. Again, it could be somewhat a reflection of effort, but a lot of those blue triangles indicate that effort was there in those places in the first atlas, and it could just be a reflection of succession shifting as timber management practices up north have changed. The flip side of some of the increases, Maine is no exception to bird declines. And the national declines for grassland birds and a lot of our aerial insectivores, it was important that we confirmed that this was happening in the state as well. And so this is very evident with the results for eastern meadowlark, which unfortunately has been lost from a lot of the state. And similarly, confirmed that bank swallow is showing and mirroring those same national trends. But as mentioned in the speaker introduction at the outset, bank swallow and cliff swallow are two examples where atlas data actually helped inform the listing. Those are two of the 5 species that we mentioned that have recently been added to the Maine Endangered Species Act, protected as threatened now since 2023. And so this is your atlas data at work for goals and positive change in the state. Arboreal birds were also especially interesting. Boreal chickadee, I put this up here as kind of a dramatic example. I'll call your attention to the down east area again. Huge declines and loss there. We will get into that a little bit later. So a shift from some of the less depressing results at the very end, just kind of give some fun fact highlights between the most confirmed species, the top 4, and the most coded species. So confirmed, again, would be species that somebody actually saw either an occupied nest or evidence of young being fed, a bird carrying food for species where it applies. And the only difference really between the most confirmed species and the most coded species is between song sparrow and red-eyed vireo. Red-eyed vireos, for any of you birders in the room, know that they're pretty familiar and very loud throughout the season. So it's not a surprise that we picked them up in most blocks. The flip side of that, on the bottom, are some of Maine's rarest species. Each of these were only confirmed in a single block of the 4,000 in the entire state, with the exception of pine grosbeak, which was actually not confirmed at all. They were only documented as possibly breeding in a few blocks in the state. Atlas 2, in total, documented 231 breeding species in the state, with an additional 5 hybrids. Of them were some newcomers that were not documented prior to or since the first atlas. All of these species between the first atlas and the second atlas had been documented in the state, but this just showed change from that first atlas metric comparison. And this slide, so these were birds that were confirmed breeding. This slide, I'll just pause here for a moment to let you take it in. These are new species, again, to the state since the first atlas, not necessarily confirmed breeding. This list just represents birds that at least met that possible criteria or higher. I will just highlight the Chuck Will's widow in that first column. This is probably the one new species that the Atlas documented for the state. Never before documented breeding in the state of Maine. We didn't actually confirm it in the years of the Atlas. We didn't confirm it until 2023, but it was found in 2021 and 2022. We just didn't confirm it until 23. So I really think the Atlas is credited for that. So on to objective 2. We wanted to produce statewide density estimates for our species as well. A lot of the ongoing sampling methods that get at estimates of abundance have a lot of weaknesses, and so there really isn't a good comprehensive, and wasn't a good comprehensive assessment. And so to do this, this is where those field technicians that I mentioned come in. Primarily, we sent them out all over the state to collect quantitative abundance data. And we really took an approach of no bird left behind. So these photos up here represent, we went beyond sampling from just traditional road-based surveys. We wanted to include, that would sample birds and diurnal raptors. We wanted to include birds specific to alpine areas in the state. Our crepuscular nightjars had a special sampling survey. We did special grassland surveys, and we also did marsh bird surveys. And so this approach is what shifted the magnitude of the data from just knowing where birds are, presence, absence in the state, to how many are there. And that actually gives us an idea of population level health. And so just a quick methods introduction to this. In total, all of these sampling survey types on the right, our technicians, and with the help of some volunteers for our nightjar and our marsh bird surveys in particular, we completed over 15,000, nearly 15,700 point-based surveys. The map on the left shows our road-based survey points, and the map on the right are our marsh bird survey points, just to give you an idea of the scale and comprehensiveness that we were shooting for. And this map, you can largely, this slide, you can largely ignore. It's just highlighting the math that basically went into what you're about to see. I will mention that in this analysis, we included habitat variables to make these predictions around the state. But again, I'm not going to get into this. You can always ask me questions if you have it. But it's not about the math here and the modeling. The math isn't the point. It's the clarity in the predictions that the math makes that you're going to see. And it gets, again, to the population level health versus just presence absence. So again, I'll just orient you to the series of slides and maps you're going to see. The one on the right should look familiar. This is our breeding evidence map. The one on the left are our density map predictions. And so what you're looking at is the darker the colors, the higher the predicted density of birds for that area of the state. And so the individual scores for each species will vary, so I'll just call your attention to that. And in the case of alder flycatcher, the density map largely kind of mirrors the distribution that we saw with the breeding evidence map. And this species showed, unsurprisingly, a strong association with shrubby habitats. In other cases, when we compare the density map with the breeding evidence map, we see areas of mismatch between the two, especially down in that southern part of the state where there were clearly birds breeding there, but our road-based surveys didn't pick up. And so this could highlight areas where birds could be, but aren't, again, because that density map is a prediction based on a model run with the data that was input to it. For killdeer, it's likely that there was just a limitation of road-based sampling efforts. While it appears to have a widespread distribution around the state, and it largely mirrors the breeding evidence map, it's important to notice where if we just look at the breeding evidence, you would think, oh yeah, hermit thrush are everywhere, they're doing great. But if you look along that 95 corridor where the faintest red is in the density map, the populated portion of Maine, even though birds are occurring there, this analysis is showing us that they're occurring in low numbers. And so again, that's a really meaningful interpretation to have for conservation and management moving forward. Magnolia warbler, the density predictions, again, largely mirror the breeding evidence, wide distribution, and not surprisingly, they occur in the largest numbers in the northwest part of the state, where timber practices are likely creating that earliest successional forest structure that's preferred by this species breeding. And then I just wanted to throw in one example from our marsh bird surveys, where we actually had to do something a little different, because the data for our marsh, for some of our special species surveys that we called them, how we collected it was a little different. So the modeling had to also be a little different. But for 10 species, we were able to do what's called an occupancy analysis. So instead of a prediction of density or abundance for these species, these models predicted occurrence or presence absence basically around the state. And so you can look at these results and see, well, bitterns could potentially occur everywhere in the state where there is a wetland. But where we actually boots on the ground work, picked them up or not, we can start looking at those comparisons to identify, well, they could be in some of these places, but why aren't they? And target some conservation efforts differently. And so we'll move on to objective 3, just those few examples. Again, to complete the first ever comprehensive winter assessment of Maine's winter birds. No behavioral categories were assigned for winter sampling. We just wanted to document where birds were and what species. We used the same block, the same grid system, but because of safety and access concerns, we didn't identify priority blocks. So you can ignore the colors on the map. The winter component was not actually launched formally until December 2019. Because of all of the atlases, of all of bird atlases conducted worldwide, only a handful have ever undertaken a winter project. And so we were sort of charting new territory, so it took us a little bit longer to figure out, how do we actually do this? So despite starting later, we did take all of the records, anything that had been entered, into our data entry platform, eBird. And we didn't initially identify, or I should just highlight, the winter season ran from the 14th of December to 15th of March, and we split it into early and late winter periods. And we didn't initially identify priority or minimum requirements for those same safety and access reasons. But by the second to last year, all of our volunteers showed us that you were a determined bunch. And so we said, okay, let's do it. So let's try to complete a minimum of one block, just any one block in a given topo quad. And that's where we reached our 83%. And so as we get into some of the winter species results next, just a reminder that these results represent people, volunteers, you all, showing up, paying attention, and contributing to something bigger than ourselves. And for that, we thank you. And Maine's birds thank you. The maps that you'll see here, the colors just represent the timing of the season that they were detected, whether it was early, late winter, or during both periods. And the chickadee is a great example. That basically shows the statewide effort coverage for our winter atlas season. Black ducks are an interesting example and kind of a fun showing, yes, our waterfowl really are largely restricted to the coast in the winter, or major riverine systems that stay ice-free, or sometimes later in the year if ice out happens early. Robin is kind of one of those familiar backyard species, and people may not even realize that they stay in the state. They can stay in the state, but certainly the northern records can be a bit surprising. And the cardinal map kind of mirrors this. That's another good example of where the concentration is largely in the central and the coast. The gray jay is a good example of where the winter map largely reflects the breeding territory as well, as this is a non-migratory species. Interestingly, there are some pockets in the winter down east where we didn't have breeding birds identified there, so more research will be needed to figure out if those are dispersing individuals or indicative of population rebound, potentially. Snowy owl is always a popular one. One of the things that this species might prompt is actually wanting to know what years those dots on the map actually represent. That kind of information is provided in the text that accompanies each species account in the book. And then bluebird is just another one that a lot of people are surprised to see how widespread they are in the state. If you heard the Maine Calling episode last month that Doug and I were both part of, it kind of turned into the bluebird show because everybody was calling it talking about bluebirds. And so we were referencing this data. And our purple sandpiper map highlights, again, we really tried to take an approach of no bird left behind. We did offshore winter surveys to try to capture all of Maine's wintering birds. And Maine hosts the largest wintering population of purple sandpipers in the US. And on to objective 4, all of you, to provide this platform for this project to connect people with nature and contribute to building this data set and insights into birds. And really, these numbers just speak for themselves. It exceeded my wildest dreams of how many people we were able to engage through this project. And the value of atlasing beyond birding is that it asks people to just connect a little bit more with nature and with what's around them. And I think when people do that, when you actually figure out and identify and understand what birds are doing or what anything's doing around you, it's really hard to not care more. It's hard to kind of fall into that ignorance is bliss. So I truly believe this project empowered people, transforming enthusiasm into scientifically valuable data points and information about birds, and fostered a lasting ethic of environmental stewardship. And so now we just need to keep that momentum and energy going for Maine's third atlas, which is going to start in just 12 more years. So a quick summary. I struggled with putting this together because I'm like, how do I summarize a project that was 9 years, millions of records, thousands and thousands of effort hours? And so one of our weekly staff meetings, I prompted my team of the other 5 individuals, and I said, what's your elevator pitch? If you have one takeaway from the atlas, what is it going to be? And I took notes on what they said. And those notes have become our summary for the presentation. So here's the takeaway, that this project delivered an unparalleled data set for Maine's birds. It is unprecedented, the scope, the most comprehensive assessment of breeding and wintering birds ever completed. And the 2 atlases actually give us that really important, valuable mirror into change over time, which again is an incredibly important and valuable tool in ecology to inform management and conservation efforts. And in a lot of ways, we also created a new baseline for future comparisons to be made. It was truly a people-powered project. All of this effort, thousands of volunteers and thousands of hours transforming the state into a living laboratory and capturing what Maine is. We are this really unique ecological crossroads of we're at the northern edge of that southern temperate region, and we're at the southern edge of a lot of the boreal ecosystems and climes. And so we hope that through this project, our volunteers and you all can see the value of what you contributed to. And in addition to Maine's third atlas starting in 12 years, New Hampshire and Vermont is actually starting this December. They're going to start a winter project. And then 2027 will mark the first of their breeding. So take a road trip and help contribute to Vermont. And what about the birds? What did we learn about the birds? We confirmed some long-held assumptions, particularly, for example, we know southern species are moving up and establishing in the state, like cardinals and titmice, but we also revealed some new and troubling patterns, namely those down east declines. This is a unique ecosystem area for the state, and it showed widespread loss of species diversity, low species richness, and it wasn't just limited to species that I highlighted, like our swallows, that are mirroring declines. We saw declines in other species, like the indigo bunting and rose-breasted grosbeak, that elsewhere in the state are doing fine, but they're being lost from the down east. And even our invasive, non-native house sparrows and starlings are being lost from the down east, which may be welcome news to some, but it sort of underscores the scope of something happening there. So that was a big takeaway from the project. But overall, all of this, it was a vital signs check of Maine's birds. What birds are doing well? What birds are stable? What birds are showing signs of stress? It highlighted the value and importance of training and transforming birding into scientifically usable observations, which we know is an important part of most atlases. But perhaps the most important part moving forward is that it created this fantastic foundation for future inquiry, for more research. It created momentum to ask new questions, to identify and direct new fields to try to solve some of these things that the Atlas data provided us insights into. And so the intent is not for this to be an end, but for it to be a beginning for this future inquiry and continue to inform management moving forward for Maine's birds. But for now, how do you get your hands on this wealth of information, right? Okay, these few slides, maybe more than a few slides, could not possibly capture all of the information of these 332 species. So enter our 750-page book. Expect it in hand by October of this year at the latest. We're hoping maybe a little earlier, but we're not holding anybody to that. And our cover art was done by Jada Fitch and Michael Boardman, two wonderful Maine artists and birders, fantastic. Make room now on your coffee tables or your bookshelves. It's gonna be big. It's 9 by 12, again, 750 pages. And it covers everything from our editorial profiles and acknowledgements, of course, to also conservation spotlight stories. We kind of went rogue. This is a new thing. Most atlases have not actually put these little essays in there interpreting the data, but these offer expert interpretation of some of the results, and they cover everything from species recovery stories. When we were writing this, I didn't actually even know that wood duck were on the brink of extinction at one point, or extirpation at one point either, to ecological processes and management of those to sustain marshes, for example. We also did an analysis looking at bulk species changes, latitudinal and elevational shifts over the 40 years between the two different atlases. And we even included a first Maine Atlas retrospective from one of our regional coordinators that actually participated in the first Maine Atlas. And then, of course, we dedicated a 3-page spread to digging into and explaining those down east declines. The book also has species account pages for all 332 species. So this is just a little snapshot from our how to use this book, how to interpret a species account chapter. And so every species has either a 2-page spread for breeding species, or for wintering only, it's a 1-page spread. And it includes one to all of the maps that I introduced you to tonight, depending on what data was available, from the breeding distribution to density, the change map, and then winter. But even all of this is just scratching the surface of what we can learn from this. Again, this is a wrap on the project. We sent the book to the publisher at the end of last year, and will be in hand by the end of this year. But an online data portal is actually in development. Amy's working hard on that to put that together so that this data can also be accessible by the general public, by conservation practitioners, academics, students. This is the role and the hope of the Atlas, is that it will provide this foundation to be used moving forward. So again, this marks not an end, but just a beginning. And we hope that you all feel inspired to continue carrying forward the value of this and contributing to citizen science. I did it under an hour. Okay. Well, it's a tough one because, I have categories of favorites, but if I have to simplify it, somebody asked me that on the street. Honestly, it's chickadees. I have been fond of chickadees from the very early parts of my ornithological career. It's one of the first birds I learned how to extract from a mist net. And I just find them, they're so tenacious, they're spunky, that I love that they are just, they're leaders of the flock. A lot of our migrants actually have learned chickadees are resident birds, and so they follow them to find food on migration in unfamiliar areas. They are also just present and amiable. I never feel alone in the winter. You go on a hike in the woods in the winter, and it's so quiet, and it feels so dead, and then you're like, dee, 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 dee. There's a little chickadee in the tree. So yeah, one of my favorites. Yep. So it is a very complex puzzle. There's climate change is likely playing a role because the ecosystem in that area is so heavily influenced by the Labrador Current and the Gulf Stream, the Gulf of Maine current that's going through there. And so as the water temperatures have changed, that has long kind of been like a refugia for some of the alpine boreal-esque areas along the coast. And so some of that may be changing. It could also be land use changes and changes in timber practices, expansion and development and urbanization, changes, we're seeing changes in agricultural use and practices in that region as well. There's a whole chapter in the book that focuses primarily on the habitats of Maine and the changing habitats, and that's one of Amy's kind of areas of expertise. But we don't actually know, and that's the hope again with this is that it just prompts that future inquiry to really identify what's happening there at a species or system level is going to require some individualized, detailed research projects. It could be a large number of things. There were about only four species in total that showed increase in the Down East region. I had them listed here. Pine warblers, merlins, house finches, and bluebirds. And so possibly figuring out why those species are doing well could hold clues to understanding why others aren't. So it's way more complex than what the Atlas could, the intent of the Atlas was to show the change. And our hope is, so if there's any academics or students in the room, or anybody that might be interested in some really needed research projects, point them in this direction. So we actually used eBird as the data entry platform for this entire project. So some of the contributions may have actually been from people that didn't even know they were contributing to the Atlas, because we just used eBird data as part of this. Right. Yes, but all of the data would have had to have had, for the breeding season in particular, would have had to have a breeding code attached to it. So there was some awareness of how to enter observations based on that. So Merlin, for those of you that don't know, is an app that's also developed and managed by Cornell Lab of Ornithology, who oversees eBird. And so Merlin is primarily an app that's used in the field for to help identify songs and audio and learning of birds. Do I use it personally? Yes, absolutely. It is a fantastic tool. Do I suggest using it cautiously? Yes, absolutely. Because it's a tool. It's not foolproof. And oftentimes, if any of you are familiar with Bob Duchesne, he has a great YouTube channel actually, and he does a whole episode on comparing, human ear detection and identification against Merlin. So it is a great tool, but I would encourage people to just use it as a tool for that, not as a definitive, decisive measurement. I've used it to even help with surveys, and if it'll pop up something, and sometimes you don't realize you missed it, and then I look down, I'm like, oh, waxwings. Okay, well, let me listen for, oh yeah, there was a waxwing flying over. Okay, I missed that. When you're sorting out the dawn chorus, especially, it can be so overwhelming for our human brain to kind of process, and Merlin can just tick them all off. But I always encourage people to don't just blindly export what you get in Merlin and put it as an eBird checklist. Really try to verify it or use it as a learning tool. But it's a fantastic resource. It's definitely improved leaps and bounds from where it was during the years of the Atlas. And I will say, to your point, a lot of QA and QC went into this data because things like that can happen. And that's one of the shortcomings of citizen science data, is that when you have 6,500 people, you're going to open up a lot of opportunity for potential error. We actually went through extensive and lengthy data review retreats. So everything that informed the maps and the results that you see really went through kind of scrutiny. We evaluated we looked at range outliers, we looked at temporal outliers in the data. So phenologically, things that were either reported too early or too late than would be expected. We went through and verified everything. All of the records also went through a lot of automated filter checks even prior to us looking at it. So things that would get reported, like a bald eagle carrying food, we couldn't accept that as necessarily indicative of confirming breeding, because a lot of raptors carry food just for themselves. So if you see an eagle flying away with a fish, that doesn't mean it's going to feed a young. It could just be going to perch somewhere else and eat it for itself. So we had a lot of automated filters that threw out records that were disconnected too. So I know that might be more than you were asking for about Merlin, but how it related to the Atlas, I think, is important.
Show that.
This analysis that I mentioned a little bit highlights some of, again, we don't get into the actual mechanisms saying climate change is causing X, Y, or Z. Most of what the Atlas is presenting is just showing the changes in time and providing speculation to prompt further research for those kinds of things. But this analysis helps identify some of the species that are showing those shifts that say, like, yeah, this is potentially climate change at work. And then we also, in each of the individual written species accounts, we asked our authors and our experts and all of us as editors, as we evaluated it, to sort of frame things best we could. Again, nothing is, the specific research was not done to look at those driving mechanisms, but we're definitely seeing exactly what you pointed out with those southern species. And there's a whole separate inset story on, what are expanding species and what do we consider vagrants? Because actually at the time of the first Atlas, cardinals in the state were considered to be vagrants. And vagrant is a word that's used to refer basically to a species that's out of range limit, it's lost, it doesn't belong here. And now it's an established breeding species in the state. So it's kind of, we offered some speculation in one of those inset stories. Okay, it's kind of interesting to think about, what are some of the species that showed up in our Atlas, this time around, that we consider vagrants, but they may actually be expanding pioneers for spreading the range. So, yeah.